She was born on a forgotten world where the ground was dry and the sky was filled with ash, and no one expected greatness to rise from such a place, yet even as a child she carried a spirit that could not be broken, and eyes that held more fire than the burning suns. She was the daughter of farmers who had lost their land to the taxes of the empire, and the soldiers who came to collect were cruel and merciless. They left her family with nothing and forced her to watch as everything she loved was stripped away. The empire was a machine that crushed entire civilizations, and to them she was no more than dust beneath their boots. But in her heart, the seed of rebellion had already been planted. As she grew, she learned to fight not with weapons at first, but with her will. She carried water across long distances. She worked the fields until her hands bled, and she listened to the cries of the people who had been silenced by fear. Each hardship sharpened her resolve, and she began to dream of more than survival. She dreamed of resistance. She dreamed of standing against the impossible. She joined secret gatherings in the night, where voices whispered of freedom, and she trained with broken blades and stolen rifles handed down from those who had dared to resist before her. When she was still young, she entered the army of the empire, not out of loyalty but to learn its ways. She disguised her hatred behind discipline and silence. She learned the language of command, the rhythm of strategy, and the weaknesses of those who ruled. She rose quickly through the ranks because she was relentless. She was sharper than her peers, and she never allowed fear to slow her. Every battle taught her something. Every defeat hardened her, and every victory brought her closer to the moment when she would strike not for the empire but against each. She became known among her comrades as a soldier who never gave up, and among her superiors as a tool they could use in their endless wars. But inside her mind, she was building a different kind of war, a secret war, one that would not only wound the empire, but one day destroy it completely. She formed bonds with those who suffered as she did, and she whispered of a future where the empire would fall. She carried these whispers like sparks in the dark, waiting for the moment when she could set the galaxy aflame. Moment came when she was ordered to lead a campaign against a rebel colony. The empire expected her to burn it to the ground and silence its people forever. But when she stood before them, she did not fire upon them. Instead, she turned her weapons against the empire itself. She rallied the rebels, she gave them strength, and she revealed herself as one of them, not as a servant of tyranny but as their champion. That was the day her legend was born. From then on, the name of the woman general began to spread across the stars. She was no longer a farmer's daughter. She was no longer a soldier of the empire. She was the storm that had risen from nothing to challenge everything. In every battle she outsmarted her enemies, and her name became a banner for the oppressed who had long been silent. The empire was vast, its fleets stretched across the stars, its armies numbered in the millions, and yet again and again she found a way to tear through its armor. She studied her enemies with patience and precision. She struck where they were weak. She vanished before they could regroup, and she returned with fury when they believed her gone. Her soldiers followed her not because they were ordered but because they believed no chain could hold them as long as she led the way. The empire called her a traitor. They painted her face on wanted posters across entire systems. They offered riches for her capture, but the people tore down those posters and hid her from the gaze of the imperial eyes. She became more than a soldier. She became a symbol, and symbols cannot be killed so easily. Entire planets rose at her signal. Colonies that had once lived in fear now armed themselves and swore to fight. She was the fire that spread across the galaxy, and the empire scrambled to contain her, but each attempt only fed the flame. She struck with brilliance that seemed impossible for one who had come from nothing. She would appear where no ship should be. She would break an enemy fleet twice her size, and she would vanish again, leaving wreckage floating in the void. Her enemies whispered that she could not be human, that perhaps she was destiny itself given form, but those who followed her knew she was simply a woman who refused to bow. Her victories were not miracles. They were the result of sleepless nights spent studying maps, calculating movements, and preparing for every outcome. The soldiers under her command were not the trained elite of the empire. They were miners, farmers, refugees, and children who had lost everything, but under her, they became warriors. She taught them discipline, she gave them purpose, and she stood beside them in the thick of battle, never hiding behind titles or ranks. She carried the same rifle as they did. She bled as they bled, and in their eyes she was not just a leader, she was one of them. The empire grew desperate. They sent their greatest generals against her. They unleashed weapons of terror that could turn cities to ash, yet nothing broke her resolve. She turned every defeat into a lesson, and every wound into a scar that reminded her of the price of freedom. She was not fearless, for she knew fear well, but she carried it like a weapon and forced her enemies to feel it even more. She looked into the eyes of those who served her and promised them that the empire would fall, and they believed because her voice carried no doubt. Her legend grew with every victory. The oppressed sang her name in secret halls, and the powerful spoke it with dread. Her story spread faster than the ships of the empire, and soon she was no longer just a rebel commander. She was the woman who could not be stopped, and the question that haunted the rulers of the galaxy was no longer if she would win, but when. The empire fell under her command, and its collapse shook the stars like thunder. For centuries it had ruled with cruelty and fear, but one woman who had risen from the dust had broken its chains. She stood on the ruins of its capital as the banners of oppression burned in the wind, and the people flooded the streets to cheer her name. They raised their hands toward her as if she were more than mortal, as if she were a savior sent by the universe itself. Yet while their voices filled the air, her heart remained heavy, for she knew the cost of victory, and she felt the silence of all who had been lost. She remembered the soldiers who had fallen beside her, their faces still clear in her mind, though their bodies had long been claimed by the soil of distant worlds. She remembered the children whose eyes had closed before ever knowing freedom, the mothers who had died clutching their sons, the fathers who had been taken and never returned. She could not silence their cries in her memory, no matter how loud the crowds shouted her name. She carried the weight of their sacrifice like armor, yet inside her soul was scarred and weary. The galaxy crowned her a hero. Some even spoke of her as a queen, though she never sought such power. She was offered thrones and palaces. She was begged to rule entire star systems, but she turned from those temptations, for she had not fought to build another empire. She wanted peace, and she wanted rest, but rest was never meant for her. Her victories had made her a symbol, and symbols could not simply vanish from history. The people still looked to her for guidance, and her enemies, though broken, still searched for a way to strike back. In her quietest hours, she walked the ruins of battlefields. Alone, she touched the broken stones and bent steel of cities she had liberated, and she whispered apologies to the dead. She knew the galaxy saw her as unshakable, as unstoppable, as the general who had crushed the empire, but she knew herself as a woman who had paid in blood and soul for every step forward. She carried triumph, but she also carried grief, and grief weighed heavier than victory. Even in victory she was restless. She had toppled the mightiest empire in history, yet a part of her still felt empty. She wondered if freedom could ever last, if the people she had fought for would build something better, or if they would simply repeat the cycle of conquest and control. She knew how power could corrupt, and she feared that her struggle might only lead to another throne, another tyrant, another war. She had torn down the chains, but who would stop them from being forged again? The galaxy did not care for her doubts. It only saw the light of her triumph. Her statues were raised on 100 worlds. Her face was carved into monuments. Her story became legend, sung in taverns and taught in schools. But behind every song lay the silence of her heart, for she knew that the louder her name became, the more alone she felt. She was victorious, yet she was also haunted, and she knew deep within that victory was only the beginning of another war. She became a mother in the years that followed, raising 3 children in the long shadow of her triumph, and though she tried to give them peace, her life had been built in the fire of war, and the scars of her battles never left her. She held them close and whispered stories of courage and freedom. She sang to them under the quiet light of alien moons, and she promised them a life without chains. Yet even as she smiled, her eyes carried the weight of endless campaigns, and her hands remembered the grip of weapons more than the touch of softness. Her children grew in the glow of her legend. They heard the voices of strangers praising her as the place's savior of the galaxy. They saw the monuments built in her honor, and they learned quickly that their mother was not like others. She was a figure carved into history, a living symbol who could never escape her past. For them, this was not a blessing but a burden, for every room they entered was filled with whispers about her victories, and every glance cast toward them was a reminder that they were the blood of the general who had crushed the empire. She tried to shield them from the world, but the galaxy would not allow it. The children saw how others worshipped her, and they also saw how others feared her, for the memory of her power still lingered, and not all believed she had been a hero. They asked her about the battles. They asked her about the soldiers she had killed and the worlds that had burned under her command. She tried to explain that war was never clean and victory was never without sacrifice, but her words did not quiet the doubts that grew in their young hearts. As the years passed, the distance between mother and children widened. She gave them love, but she also gave them discipline, for she had known only discipline in her own life. She demanded strength, she demanded resilience, and though her intent was to prepare them for a harsh galaxy, they began to see her not as a gentle mother but as a general, who never stopped commanding. She wanted them to rise higher than she had ever dreamed, but they wanted only to live free of the shadows she cast. Each child carried their own secret resentment. The eldest believed she had stolen their childhood by raising them under the weight of her cause. The second believed she had chosen the galaxy over her own blood, caring more for strangers than for the warmth of family. The youngest simply longed for her to be a mother and not a warrior, but every time he looked into her eyes he saw the fire of battle still burning. She had given them life, yet she had also given them chains, forged not of iron but of expectation and legacy. She saw the storm growing in them, though she tried to ignore it. She thought time would heal their doubts. She thought love would bridge the silence that stretched across their home, but time did not heal, and love did not silence the wounds of their hearts. Instead, they grew restless, they grew bitter, and they grew apart from her. And though she had conquered the mightiest empire in history, she began to fear that the greatest battle of her life would not be fought across the stars, but within the walls of her own home. As they grew older, the doubts that lived in their hearts became sharper, and the silence between them and their mother grew heavier. The eldest confronted her one night, his voice steady yet filled with anger. He told her that the galaxy saw her as a savior, but he saw her as a thief who had stolen the simple life of a child. He said he had never known the warmth of a mother, only the commands of a general and the cold shadow of her endless victories. She listened without reply, for she knew there was truth in his words, but she could not find a way to answer them. Second child was quieter, yet her resentment was deeper. She had watched her mother leave again and again to settle disputes across the galaxy, for even after the fall of the empire many systems begged for her guidance. The second child grew bitter, believing that her mother belonged to the galaxy and not to her own family. She wrote words in secret journals, words filled with anger and sorrow, words that she could never speak aloud, for she feared the power in her mother's gaze. She longed for a mother's touch, but felt she had been given only a leader's commands. The youngest was torn between love and grief. He adored his mother for her strength, he admired her courage, and he wanted to believe she was everything the galaxy said she was. Yet every time he reached for her, he found her distant. Her eyes seemed always fixed on memories of war, and her embrace, though warm, was brief. He felt unseen, and though he loved her more than the others, he too began to wonder if she had ever truly chosen them, or if they had been born into a life already doomed by the shadow of her legend. Whispers of the past filled their ears as they ventured beyond their home. For every person who praised their mother, another spoke of the lives she had taken. Some called her liberator, others called her butcher, and these voices planted deeper doubts in the children. They asked themselves if their mother had truly been a hero, or if she had simply replaced one tyrant with another. They began to wonder if her victories had been for freedom or for power. And in those questions their love turned colder. One by one they drifted away from her. The eldest left first, seeking his own path beyond her reach. He carried with him a sword of anger sharpened by years of bitterness. The second left in silence, carrying only her journals and her quiet fury. The youngest lingered the longest, torn between loyalty and resentment, but even he finally walked away, unable to bear the weight of being the child of the woman who had crushed an empire. She stood alone in the home she had built from the ashes of war, and felt the emptiness her victories could not fill. She had given her life to free the galaxy, but in doing so she had lost the very souls she loved most. She told herself they would return, she told herself time would heal, yet deep within, she knew the truth. Her children were gone, and they carried with them not gratitude but anger, and anger would one day return to her. They left her behind, and each carried the fire of resentment that burned brighter with every passing year. The eldest hardened his heart in exile and carved a path among mercenaries and wanderers. He proved himself ruthless and cunning, and soon men followed him, not because of who his mother had been, but because of his own unyielding strength. He spoke of building a world where no throne, no general, and no empire could ever command another. He promised freedom, but what he built was an army, forged in bitterness, and driven by the wound of a son who felt abandoned. The second child wandered among scholars and rebels, listening to the voices of those who had suffered under the war. She gathered knowledge, she studied history, she uncovered secrets of her mother's campaigns that were never told in song. She read the numbers of the dead, she walked among the ruins of cities, and she felt her heart harden against the woman who had given her life. She spoke to the broken, and they listened. She gave them words that turned grief into anger, and slowly she built a following of her own, not with weapons, but with conviction. She became a voice that could shake the ground, and her followers grew into a movement. The youngest child drifted in silence across the galaxy, carrying the torn loyalty of love and betrayal. He sought wisdom in distant temples. He sought strength among forgotten warriors, and he found no peace in either place. In his heart he longed to forgive his mother, yet every story he heard reminded him of blood and chains. He was drawn to the path of his siblings, for though he loved her, he loved justice more, and he came to believe that justice demanded he rise against the shadow that had shaped his life. He trained until his body was unbreakable and his will unshakable, and when he returned from exile, he was no longer a boy but a warrior who carried the sorrow of his childhood like a blade. Each child stood apart, yet each carried the same vow. They would return, not as children but as conquerors. They would face the woman who had shaped the galaxy, and they would demand from her the price of their pain. The eldest gathered fleets from outlaws and rebels. The second gathered voices that spread like fire, and the youngest stood between them as the bond that held their vengeance together. What they built was not a rebellion. It was not an empire. It was something colder and sharper. It was a storm rising from the wound of family. She heard whispers of their rise. She learned of the armies of the eldest, the movements of the second, and the growing legend of the youngest. She told herself they would not turn against her, that their anger would fade when they saw the truth of her heart, but deep inside, she felt the tremor of fear, for she knew the strength of her blood, and she knew that the fire she had given them would one day burn her, as it burned the empire she had crushed. And so the galaxy prepared for another war, one not between tyrants and liberators, but between a mother who had conquered the stars, and 3 children who returned to conquer her. Years passed and the galaxy changed, yet the shadow of her name never faded. Entire worlds still raised monuments to her victories and sang songs of her triumph, while others cursed her as a destroyer who had left nothing but ashes in her wake. And then the whispers became louder, whispers of fleets gathering in the void, whispers of armies marching under banners, not of the old empire, but of a new force unknown and unstoppable. She listened to these whispers with unease, for in them she heard the echo of her own blood. The eldest returned first with warships black as the void, each one bearing the scars of countless battles. He had forged his fleet from the broken and the cast aside men and women who had no place in the galaxy, and who now followed him with blind loyalty. His ships swept across border worlds, crushing resistance with merciless precision. He declared not conquest, but reckoning. He declared that justice would fall upon the woman who had stolen the lives of her own children, and the galaxy trembled at his words. The second returned, not with fleets, but with a tide of voices. Her followers spread across planets like wildfire, carrying her words to the oppressed and the forgotten. She spoke with a calm fury, and her message was simple. The woman they called savior was no savior at all. She was a tyrant who had hidden her throne beneath the illusion of freedom. Her speeches stirred hearts, her promises lit fires, and entire colonies turned away from the mother and toward the daughter who gave them new hope. Her movement was not fought with guns but with belief, and belief is a weapon. No army can silence. The youngest returned last, and his arrival was the most haunting. He did not speak with anger. He did not roar with fury. Instead, he stood silent at the front of his siblings, his eyes filled with sorrow, yet his hand steady on the hilt of his blade. He commanded warriors who had once lived in exile, monks and fighters who had long rejected the chaos of the galaxy, yet for him, they marched for him. They prepared to die. His silence became legend, for in every corner of the galaxy, they whispered that the youngest son would be the one to strike the final blow, not out of hate, but out of duty. The 3 stood united, their armies, their fleets, and their voices stretching across the stars. They did not call themselves heirs. They did not call themselves rebels. They called themselves avengers of truth. They spoke not only to their mother, but to the galaxy, declaring that her reign as symbol and savior had ended, and that now she must answer for the scars she had left behind. She stood on her world of refuge, watching the skies darken as fleets began to gather above. She had faced countless enemies. She had defeated the empire itself, but she had never faced her own blood. She felt the weight of the past pressing upon her shoulders, and for the first time in many years, she wondered if she had the strength to raise her sword again, not against tyrants, not against oppressors, but against the children she had once held in her arms. And the galaxy held its breath, waiting for the storm to fall. The woman general stood upon the same ground where she had once broken the empire, her boots pressing into the dust of a battlefield, now haunted by silence. She had thought the end of the empire would bring peace, but instead it had only prepared her for this moment when her greatest enemies would not be strangers but her own blood. The horizon was filled with the glow of ships descending through the clouds, their shadows stretching across the earth like claws reaching for her throat. The people who had once cheered her name now hid in fear, unsure if they should still call her savior, or if they should abandon her to her fate. The eldest was the first to step forward, his armor scarred, his eyes cold. He looked upon his mother with no love left in his heart, and his voice carried the fury of years of resentment. He accused her of robbing him of a childhood, of turning his life into a weapon, of chaining him to her victories. He told her that the galaxy saw her as a liberator, but to him she was nothing but a thief of innocence. He raised his sword toward her and promised that she would fall as the empire had fallen. The second came next, and her words were sharper than any blade. She stood, with the fire of her followers behind her, and declared that the mother had lied to the galaxy. She said the blood on her hands could not be washed away with songs or statues. She said the woman who had crushed the empire had only built another shadow of tyranny, a shadow that still darkened the lives of countless people. She spoke with such conviction that even some who once served the mother began to waver as they listened. Then came the youngest, and he walked in silence until he stood face to face with her. His eyes were heavy with sorrow, and his hand rested on the hilt of his blade. He did not speak at first, but when he did, his words cut deeper than those of his siblings. He told her that he had loved her, that he had wanted to believe in her, but that love had turned into grief too heavy to carry. He said he could no longer fight for her. He could only fight for the truth, and if that truth meant her fall, then so be it. She listened to them, and her heart trembled more than it ever had in battle. She had faced armies, she had faced fleets, she had faced death itself, but nothing had wounded her like the voices of her own children. She wanted to reach for them. She wanted to remind them of the nights she had held them close, of the songs she had sung beneath the stars, yet the fire in their eyes told her that those memories were gone, replaced by the steel of vengeance. Still she did not lower her gaze. She raised her head and declared that she had fought for freedom, that she had never sought power for herself, and that every drop of blood had been spilled to break the chains of the empire. She told them that if they wished to see her as a monster, then they would have to face the truth with their own hands. She stood tall, her weapon at her side, her voice steady, even as her heart broke. And the battlefield waited for the first strike between mother and children. The battlefield erupted with a silence heavier than thunder, as mother and children stood locked in a circle of fate. The armies on both sides held their breath, for they knew the war would not be decided by fleets or soldiers, but by the clash of blood against blood. The eldest raised his sword first and charged with fury, his strikes fueled by years of rage. She parried with the strength of a warrior who had faced death 1,000 times, and though his blows shook her bones, she did not falter. She saw in his eyes not just hatred but pain, the pain of a child who had once reached for her hand and found only the steel of duty. The second moved next, her words carrying the weight of 1,000 voices. She commanded the ground with her speeches. Even as her troops pressed forward, she accused her mother of every life lost, of every scar left upon the galaxy. Her voice was a storm meant to shatter resolve, yet the mother did not yield. She answered not with speeches, but with silence, for she knew that no words could heal what had been broken. Her silence enraged the daughter more than any denial, and she pressed harder, vowing to tear down the image of Savior, until nothing remained. The youngest did not strike at first. He stood watching, torn between love and grief, his blade heavy in his hand. At last he moved forward, and when he did, the world seemed to stop. His strike was precise, not fueled by fury but by sorrow. His blade met hers, and in that clash he felt the weight of all the years he had longed for her to be something she could never be. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, her strength faltered, for she saw not an enemy but the child she had once carried in her arms. The battle raged, and the ground shook with the force of their conflict, yet it was not armies that clashed, it was memories, it was wounds, it was the echo of lullabies turned into war. Cries. The eldest fought with rage, the second with conviction, the youngest with sorrow, and she fought with all that remained of her heart. The sky burned with fire, the earth split with tremors, and the galaxy watched as legend faced its own legacy. The final moment she stood wounded, her breath heavy, her body failing, yet her spirit unbroken. Her children surrounded her, blades raised, voices filled with fury. She looked at them and spoke, not as a general, not as a savior, but as a mother. She told them that if they wished her end, then they must take it with their own hands, for she would not strike to kill them. She lowered her weapon and opened her arms as if to embrace them one last time. The eldest hesitated, his rage trembling. The second faltered, her words caught in her throat. The youngest stood frozen, tears burning in his eyes. None could deliver the final blow, for in that moment, they saw not the legend, not the general, not the savior, not the tyrant, but the woman who had given them life and which carried their pain within her. The battle ended not with victory, not with defeat, but with silence, a silence that spread across the galaxy, a silence that spoke of wounds too deep to heal, and of a story that would live forever, not in triumph, nor in vengeance, but in the fragile truth of blood, love, and loss.